After 18 years in the system, a boy who was told his only inheritance was a key to a sealed bunker in the woods would discover the truth was buried much deeper than the ground. And what he found there wasn't just about the past. It was about a choice that would define his entire future. If you've ever felt like you were given nothing, like the world had already decided who you were, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're going to unpack this together. The final paper they gave me was thin and cold, the kind of cheap copy paper that felt like it would dissolve if you held it too long. It was a deed, 1.3 acres of undeveloped land in a county I'd never heard of, somewhere up north where the rain never stopped. Attached to it with a rusty paperclip was a key. It was heavy, made of pitted iron, the kind of thing you'd see in a movie about castles or dungeons, not something that belonged to the modern world. Mrs. Albright, the administrator for transitional services, pushed the documents across her particle board desk with two perfectly manicured fingers. She looked at me over the top of her glasses, her expression a careful mixture of pity and impatience. It was a look I'd seen 1,000 times. "That's it, Leo, the sum total of your grandfather's estate." Her voice was dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "The land is assessed at almost nothing, mostly rock and second-growth timber, and there are back taxes owed. Our recommendation is to sign it over to the county. They'll auction it, and you might get a few $100s after the debt is cleared." I stared at the key. It was cold against my palm, a solid, undeniable weight. For 12 years, since I was 6, my grandfather had been a ghost story. A crazy old man, they said, who got tangled in paranoia and just disappeared. Abandoned me. That was the word they always used. He abandoned you. I looked from the key to Ms. Albright's face. She saw a problem to be processed, another file to be closed. 18 years of being a file, a case number, a line item in a budget. I was graduating, not from a school, but from a system. They called it emancipation. It felt more like being evicted. "What's the key for?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the quiet, sterile office. She sighed, a little puff of air that said this was taking longer than it should. "The file says there's a structure on the property, a concrete bunker, sealed. Your grandfather built it in his final years. Like I said, Leo, the man was unwell. Unwell, paranoid, crazy. The words they used to sand down the sharp edges of a story I never got to hear. They gave me a narrative, tidy and institutional, where he was the villain and I was the victim, and the state was the reluctant hero. But holding that key, I felt a flicker of something else, a question. Why seal it? Why leave me the key? "I'll keep it," I said. Ms. Albright raised an eyebrow. "The land? Leo, the taxes are over $1,000. The money the state provides for your transition won't even cover that. You'll be in debt before you even find a place to live. It's not a smart move. It's sentimental." Sentiment was a luxury I couldn't afford. I knew that. I had 2 duffel bags of clothes, a new Social Security card, a check for $2,500 that was meant to be my bridge to the real world, and a crushing sense of vertigo. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and she was telling me the rock I was holding on to was worthless. But it was the only thing that was mine. The only thing that connected me to a time before the group homes, before the foster parents who looked at me with that same tired pity. "I'll keep it," I repeated, my voice a little firmer this time. I folded the deed, the paper crinkling in protest, and slid it into the pocket of my jacket. The key went into my other pocket, its weight a strange comfort. She shrugged, the gesture washing her hands of me and my bad decisions. Fine, it's your choice. Your bus ticket is for 7 a.m. tomorrow. The shelter in Portland has a bed for you for 2 weeks. After that, you're on your own. Good luck, Leo. On my own. The words echoed in the silence of the room. I'd been surrounded by people my whole life. Caseworkers, therapists, other kids as lost as I was. But I had always been on my own. The only difference was that now the walls were gone. I walked out of that office and didn't look back. The hallway smelled of floor wax and quiet desperation. The same smell it had every day for the 6 years I'd lived at the facility. But this time, I was just a visitor. I was already a ghost. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the cot in my small cinder block room and held the key. I turned it over and over in my hand, the metal warming to my touch. A bunker. A sealed bunker. It sounded like something a crazy person would build. A tomb. A place to hide from the world. Or a place to hide something from the world. The question lodged itself in my chest, a sharp little hook. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt something other than the dull ache of just getting through the day. I felt a pull, a purpose. It was probably a stupid, childish feeling, hope, but it was there. The next morning, I didn't get on the bus to Portland. I went to the station, but I walked right past the line of people waiting for the southbound express. I went to the other counter, the one for the regional lines that snaked their way up the coast and into the deep, green wilderness of the north. I bought a one-way ticket to a town called North Fork, the closest stop to the coordinates on the deed. I was supposed to be starting my new life. Instead, I was going to dig up the old one. My emancipation check felt impossibly thin in my pocket as I paid for the ticket. I was betting almost everything I had on a ghost story and a rusty key. It was the first real choice I had ever made, and I had no idea if it was the beginning of my freedom or just a faster way to hit rock bottom. The bus smelled of stale coffee and wet wool. It was an old machine, groaning its way up the coast, tracing a line between the gray Pacific and the endless, dark curtain of the forest. For hours, I just watched the world go by, a blur of green and gray. Every town we passed through looked smaller than the last, the buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the encroaching wilderness. I thought about the files they must have had on me. Leo Vance, ward of the state, mother deceased, father unknown. Grandfather, Samuel Vance, whereabouts unknown, presumed deceased. History of behavioral issues, withdrawn, difficulty forming attachments. It was all true, I guess, but it wasn't the whole truth. It was a story written by strangers. I remembered my grandfather, but only in flashes, like faded photographs. I remembered the smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco in his workshop. I remembered his hands, big and calloused, showing me how to hold a hammer. He was building something in the yard, a big wooden frame. A house, maybe. He was always building things, and he was always humming, a low, tuneless sound that was as constant as the rain. They said he started to change, that he grew quiet, and his eyes were always scanning the street. They said he started talking about people watching him, about conspiracies. The last time I saw him, he hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. He told me to be a good boy, and then he was gone. The system scooped me up, and the story of the crazy old man began. North Fork wasn't so much a town as a punctuation mark at the end of a long, winding road. A gas station, a diner, a general store, and a handful of houses sinking slowly into the moss. When I stepped off the bus, the air was so clean and cold it felt like swallowing glass. The silence was absolute. broken only by the drip of water from the eaves of the bus shelter. A man in a flannel shirt and a greasy baseball cap was leaning against a pickup truck, watching me. He was the only other person in sight. Locals can smell an outsider like a wolf smells a wound. "You lost, kid?" he asked. His voice was gravelly. I shook my head. "Looking for a piece of land, off Ridge Road." He squinted, his eyes disappearing into the wrinkles at their corners. "Ain't much up Ridge Road 'cept trees and trouble. Who owns it?" "My grandfather did," I said. "Samuel Vance." The man's expression changed. The suspicion in his eyes softened into something that looked a little like pity. It was a look I knew well. Sam Vance. Haven't heard that name in years. He was a good man. Got a little sideways at the end, but he had a good heart. He pushed himself off the truck. "You're his grandkid, huh?" "I'll be damned." He stuck out a hand. "Name's Gus. I run the store." I shook his hand. It was rough as bark. "Leo." "Well, Leo, Ridge Road is 5 miles up that way," he said, pointing up a steep, paved road that vanished into the trees. "You ain't gonna find a cab out here. You need a ride?" I hesitated. Years in the system teach you to be wary of kindness. It's almost always got a price tag. But then I looked at the road and at my 2 duffel bags, and I felt the weariness of the long bus ride settle deep into my bones. "I'd appreciate it," I said. Gus's truck smelled like motor oil and wet dog. The cab was cluttered with tools, empty coffee cups, and fishing lures. As we drove, the last of the town fell away, and we were swallowed by the forest. The trees were giants, their branches interlocking high above us, creating a permanent twilight on the road below. It felt like driving through a tunnel. "So you came to see the old place," Gus said, breaking the silence. "Not much to see. Sam sold his house in town before he left. All he kept was that patch of woods up the hill." "The deed says there's a bunker," I said. Gus shot me a sideways glance. "Oh yeah, the bunker. He spent the better part of a year building that thing. Poured the concrete himself. People in town thought he'd lost his mind, stocking up for the end of the world or something." He chuckled, but it was a sad sound. "He was different after his daughter, after your mom passed. And then he got laid off from the mill when it shut down. He started digging into things. Said the company that bought the land was dirty. No one listened. They just wanted the jobs back." A new piece of the story, a piece that wasn't in my file. My grandfather wasn't just paranoid. He was angry. He was grieving. He was fighting something. "What company?" I asked. "West Tech Development," Gus said, the name rolling off his tongue with a sour taste. "Promised a new processing plant, new jobs. Never happened. They logged the old growth, took what they wanted, and left a mess. Now they're back, sniffing around again, trying to buy up all the little parcels they missed the first time, including, I'd bet, your grandfather's." He slowed the truck and pointed to a narrow, overgrown track that branched off the main road. A faded wooden sign, barely visible under a coat of moss, read Vance. "This is it," Gus said. "End of the line for me. The track's too washed out for the truck." He pulled over. The silence rushed back in, deeper this time. "You sure you want to be up here alone, kid? It gets dark fast in these woods." "I'll be okay," I said, though my heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. The store's open till 6. If you need anything, you know where to find me." I grabbed my bags from the back of the truck. "Thanks, Gus, for the ride, and for talking about him." "He was a good man," Gus repeated, as if it was important that I knew. "Don't let anyone tell you different." He put the truck in gear, gave me a final worried look, and drove away, his taillights disappearing into the gloom. And then I was alone. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The only sound was the whisper of the wind in the high branches. I stood at the head of the track, staring into the woods. My property. It felt like standing at the edge of another world. I shouldered my bags and started walking. The track was more of a suggestion than a path, a muddy scar winding through a dense maze of ferns and fallen logs. The light was failing, the sky turning a bruised purple. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like a footstep behind me. The paranoia they said my grandfather had, it felt contagious. After about 15 minutes of pushing through the undergrowth, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a hard, geometric line that didn't belong in the organic chaos of the forest. A flat, gray rectangle rising out of a small clearing. The bunker. It was smaller than I'd imagined, about the size of a one-car garage, and half buried in the hillside. The concrete was stained dark with rain and streaked with moss. There were no windows, only a single, heavy steel door set deep into the wall. It looked less like a building and more like a tombstone, a monument to one man's fear. I dropped my bags and walked toward it, my boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground. The air around the bunker felt colder, heavier. I reached out and touched the steel door. It was icy cold and slick with condensation. In the center of the door was a keyhole, protected by a sliding metal cover. I pulled the iron key from my pocket. My hand was shaking. For a moment, I just stood there, key in hand, the whole weight of the last 12 years pressing down on me. What was I doing here? I was chasing a ghost, following a breadcrumb trail left by a man everyone said was crazy. This was a mistake. I should have taken the bus to Portland, to the shelter, to the life they had planned for me, the sensible life. But I couldn't. I had to know. With a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock. It scraped, fighting me for a second, then slid home with a solid, satisfying clunk. I gripped the key with both hands and turned. For a second, nothing happened. I put my shoulder into it, pushing, and then I heard it. A series of deep, metallic groans from inside the door. The sound of tumblers, thick with rust and disuse, slowly, reluctantly, giving way. One by one, they clicked open. A final, loud thud echoed in the quiet woods, and the key turned the last quarter-inch. It was unlocked. I pulled on the heavy handle. The door didn't budge. It was sealed tight by 12 years of rain and rust. I pulled again, bracing my feet against the muddy ground, my muscles straining. It moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved, breaking a seal of grime with a sound like tearing fabric. A puff of stale, musty air escaped from the crack, a captured breath held for over a decade. It smelled of dust, oil, and something else, something faint and familiar. Sawdust. I pulled harder, and the door swung inward with a low, mournful screech of tortured hinges. It opened into absolute blackness, a void that seemed to suck the last of the evening light out of the air. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding. My phone had a flashlight. I fumbled it out of my pocket, my fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. I turned it on, and the thin, white beam cut into the darkness. The light fell on a set of steep concrete steps leading down. I took the first step, then the next, descending into the earth. The air grew colder, and the smell of dust and old memories grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, I swept the light across the room. It wasn't a survivalist's hoard. There were no crates of canned food or barrels of water. There were no racks of guns. It was a workshop. A long wooden workbench ran along one wall, covered in tools laid out with neat precision. Vices, clamps, saws, and drills, all coated in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise perfectly preserved. Shelves on the opposite wall were filled with jars of screws and nails, spools of wire, and neatly labeled boxes of electrical components. In the center of the room was a large drafting table, a stool tucked neatly beneath it, and in the far corner, covered by a heavy canvas tarp, was a large, boxy shape. It was a time capsule, a sanctuary. This wasn't the fortress of a madman. It was the workspace of a craftsman. My grandfather. I walked over to the workbench, my flashlight beam dancing over the tools. I ran my finger over the handle of a wood plane, leaving a clean streak in the dust. I could almost see him standing here, shavings of wood curling up at his feet, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut pine. I could hear his low, tuneless humming. This was his place, the place he had retreated to. I moved toward the center of the room, to the drafting table. On its surface, held down by a glass paperweight, was a single sheet of paper. It was a map, a hand-drawn, incredibly detailed map of the 1.3 acres. My 1.3 acres. It showed the contours of the land, the creek that ran along the western edge, and the location of the bunker, marked with a simple X. But there were other markings too. Faint pencil lines, notations in a spidery script. And in the northeast corner of the property, a section was circled in red, with a note next to it. Ground Zero, do not disturb. Ground Zero. The words sent a chill down my spine. It sounded military, dangerous. What had he found up here? I swept my light around the room again, looking for more clues. My eyes landed on the tarp in the corner. Whatever was under it, it was big. I walked over and gripped the edge of the heavy, dusty canvas. I pulled it back. Underneath was not a generator or a water tank. It was a metal cabinet. A filing cabinet, old and gray, the kind you see in old offices. And next to it, on the floor, was a heavy, military green footlocker. Both were secured with thick padlocks. My heart started to beat faster. This was it. This was what he had sealed in here. I looked at the padlocks. They were heavy-duty. I had no key for them. I scanned the workshop, my light flashing over the tools. On the wall, hanging from a hook, was a crowbar. I grabbed it. It felt heavy and powerful in my hands. I wedged the tip into the hasp of the footlocker's padlock and leaned on it. The metal creaked and groaned. I reset my grip and threw my whole weight into it. With a sharp crack, the hasp snapped. The lock fell to the concrete floor with a clang that echoed in the silent bunker. I knelt and lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker. My hands were shaking again. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was a single object. A shoebox, old and battered, held shut with a crumbling rubber band. It was addressed to me. In my grandfather's familiar, spidery handwriting, it said, "For Leo, when you're old enough to understand." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. A message from the ghost. A letter from the past. I lifted the box out. It was lighter than I expected. I slid the brittle rubber band off, and it snapped and turned to dust in my fingers. I took a deep breath, and I opened the box. Inside, there wasn't money. There weren't jewels. There was a stack of envelopes, bound together with twine. On top of the stack was a single, thick envelope with my name on it. And beneath the letters, tucked into the corner of the box, was something else. Something that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was a photograph, a faded Polaroid of a smiling woman with kind eyes, holding a little boy on her lap. The boy had a gap-toothed grin and a mess of dark hair. It was my mother. And it was me. I hadn't seen a picture of her in 12 years. The system had files, but no photographs, no sentiment. I picked it up, my thumb tracing the outline of her face. A wave of grief, so sudden and so sharp it felt like a physical blow, knocked the air out of me. I sat down hard on the cold concrete floor, the shoebox in my lap, and for the first time since I was a little boy, I cried. I cried for the mother I barely remembered, for the grandfather I'd thought had abandoned me, and for the lost, lonely kid who had been raised by paperwork and policies. The silence of the bunker was complete. It held the space for my grief, a quiet, patient witness. After a long time, the tears subsided, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. I wiped my eyes on the sleeve of my jacket and looked back into the box. It was time to read the letter. I picked up the thick envelope, my name written on the front. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick and yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully. The letter was long, page after page covered in my grandfather's dense, slightly slanted handwriting. I angled my phone's light onto the first page and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means I am gone. It means that I failed in my most important promise, which was to see you grow into a man. For that, I am sorry. More sorry than words can ever say. I know what they will have told you. They will have said I went crazy. They will have said I abandoned you. It's a simpler story, but it's not the truth. The truth is buried here, with this letter, and I am trusting you with it." I had to stop and take a breath. His voice, his actual voice, was on the page. It was like he was sitting there in the dark with me. I read on. "It started after your mother died. The grief was a fog I couldn't see through. And then the mill closed. The life I'd known, the town I'd helped build, it all just vanished. West Tech Development bought the old mill property and all the timber rights. They promised jobs, a new beginning. We were all so desperate for hope, we didn't ask the right questions." His handwriting grew tighter, angrier on the page. "I took a job with them, part of the cleanup crew at the old site. That's when I started finding things. Barrels, hundreds of them, buried in unlined pits deep in the woods, not far from the creek. They were leaking a thick black sludge into the ground. I knew it was poison. I took samples. I made notes. I thought if I just showed someone, if I just told the truth, they would have to do something." I looked up from the letter, my eyes drawn to the hand-drawn map on the drafting table. The area circled in red. Ground Zero. It wasn't a paranoid delusion. It was a real place. It was a toxic waste dump. "I was naive," the letter continued. "West Tech wasn't just a development company. It was a shell corporation for the same chemical conglomerate that had been poisoning towns up and down the coast for decades. When I took my evidence to the regional EPA office, I was met with silence. When I went to the press, the story was buried. And then The threats began. Quietly at first. A man in a suit on my doorstep offering me money to forget what I saw. A dead bird on my porch. My brake lines cut. My blood ran cold. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. This was terrifying. I knew they would come for me, but I was a stubborn old fool. I thought I could fight them. Then one afternoon, I came to pick you up from school, and I saw a car parked across the street. The same car that had been following me. The man inside was watching you. Watching you, Leo. A 6-year-old boy on the playground. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about me anymore. They weren't just going to come for me. They would use you to silence me. They would take you or hurt you, and I would be broken. I could feel the raw terror in his words, the desperate calculus of a man trapped. I had a choice, a terrible, impossible choice. I could stay and fight and risk your life, or I could disappear and keep you safe. The state system is a cold, heartless machine, Leo. I knew that. I hated myself for it. But I also knew it was a fortress. It was the one place they couldn't touch you. A ward of the state is anonymous, accounted for, buried in bureaucracy. You would be safe from them even if you weren't safe from the loneliness. It was the greatest failure of my life and the only act of love I had left to give. I had to put the letter down. My whole world was tilting on its axis. The story I had carried for 12 years, the story of my abandonment, was a lie. It wasn't a story of neglect. It was a story of protection, a brutal, heartbreaking, desperate act of love. He hadn't thrown me away. He had hidden me. He had sacrificed his name, his reputation, his place in the world, and his relationship with me, just to keep me safe. The weight of that sacrifice settled on me, immense and suffocating. I picked up the letter again, my vision blurred. I bought this piece of land because it sits directly on top of their primary dump site. This bunker is not for me, Leo. It's a seal, a plug, to keep this poison in the ground. As long as this land belongs to our family, they can't build on it. They can't dig. They can't expose their crime. And they can't erase it. This land, this worthless, rocky patch of woods, is the only thing holding them accountable. It is a lock on their secret. The other documents in this box and in the filing cabinet are all the proof. The original soil reports, the internal memos I copied, photographs of the barrels, a sworn affidavit from another worker who they paid to keep quiet and who later died of cancer. It's everything. It's the truth. Now they are back. Gus, if he's still around, will have told you. They're trying to buy up the land. They'll offer you money. It will probably seem like a lot of money to a young man with nothing. They will tell you it's a smart deal. They will pressure you. They will threaten you, just as they threatened me. And so, my boy, my inheritance to you is not this land. It is not this bunker. It is a choice. You can take their money, sell this place, take the evidence, and disappear. Go build a life for yourself somewhere far away. Be safe. Be happy. There is no shame in that. God knows you've earned it. I will not blame you. I would understand. Or you can fight. You can use what I've left you. You can finish the job I started. It will be hard. It will be dangerous. They are powerful, and you are just one person. But you will not be alone. In this box there is a name, a lawyer in Seattle, an old friend of mine from the service. He knows some of this story. If you choose to fight, call him. He will help you. The choice is yours, Leo. You can have a life, or you can have a legacy. I cannot and will not make that choice for you. I can only tell you that I love you, always. Your grandfather, Samuel." The letter ended there. I sat in the echoing silence of the concrete room, the pages trembling in my hand. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore, it was deep in my bones. He had given me an escape route, a permission slip to run. "Take the money," he'd said. "Be safe, be happy." And for a wild, intoxicating moment, I considered it. I could walk out of these woods, sell this cursed piece of land to the devil, and be free. I could have a real life, an apartment, a job, a future that wasn't haunted by ghosts and poison. I could forget North Fork, forget West Tech, forget Samuel Vance and his impossible choice. But then I looked at the photograph of my mother, and I looked at the name of the lawyer on a separate small card. Arthur Davies, with a Seattle phone number. And I thought of Gus saying, "He was a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different." My grandfather hadn't just left me a choice. He had left me his trust. He had trusted that the boy he'd hidden away would grow into a man who could understand the weight of this secret. He had trusted me to be his heir, not just to a piece of land, but to a moral battle. To sell would be to spit on his sacrifice. It would be to say that his years in hiding, my years in the system, were all for nothing. It would be to let them win, to let them pave over their crime and build a future on a foundation of lies and poison. I stood up, my legs stiff. I walked over to the filing cabinet. The crowbar was still in my hand. I jammed it into the lock mechanism in pride. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound of agony, and then the top drawer popped open. It was filled with files, thick manila folders meticulously labeled. Soil samples, analysis, internal memos, WT dumping protocol. Correspondence, EPA Region 10. It was all here, a lifetime of righteous fury, organized and catalogued. This wasn't the work of a crazy person. This was the work of a soldier. I closed the drawer. I knew what I had to do. There was no real choice, not for me. My grandfather had given me one, but my entire life, the one he had so painfully shaped, had led me to this single conclusion. You don't run, you don't hide, you fight. I walked back up the concrete steps, emerging from the dark bunker into the twilight. The forest was no longer menacing. It felt protective. The trees stood like silent sentinels, guarding the secret alongside me. I pulled out my phone. The battery was low, but there was a faint signal. 2 bars, enough. My hands were steady now. I looked at the card with the lawyer's name on it. Arthur Davies. I dialed the number. After 3 rings, a tired, gravelly voice answered. "Davies?" "Mr. Davies?" I said, my voice hoarse. "My name is Leo Vance. I'm Samuel Vance's grandson." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a clock ticking. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, wary. "Sam's boy? Where are you?" "I'm at the property," I said. "In the bunker. I found his letter." Another pause. I heard him exhale slowly. "I'll be damned. He actually did it. Listen to me, son. Don't talk to anyone. Don't let anyone on that property. Are they there? Have they tried to contact you?" "Not yet," I said, "but I know they're coming." "Good. That gives us time," he said. "Don't move. I'm 2 hours away. I'm leaving now. We have a lot to talk about." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. 2 hours. It felt like a lifetime. The weight of my decision settled on me, not as a burden, but as a foundation. I was no longer a ward of the state. I was no longer a victim. I was the guardian of this land. I was the keeper of a promise. I was my grandfather's heir. I stood there for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, the iron key clutched tight in my hand. The fight was just beginning, and I was ready. Now, I want to pause here for a second. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story, the feeling of inheriting a problem that's bigger than you, of having to choose between what's easy and what's right, it's something I think a lot of us can understand in our own ways. Maybe it's not a poisoned piece of land, but a family secret, a difficult truth, or a promise you feel you have to keep. If this is hitting home for you, if you've ever had to face a choice like that, I want you to know you're not alone. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been put in a position where you had to finish something someone else started. This community we're building here is about sharing those stories. So please, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get back to what happened next. Because the lawyer arriving was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the war. The 2 hours I waited for Arthur Davies felt longer than the 12 years I'd spent in the system. The darkness in the forest became absolute, a thick, living blackness that pressed in on all sides. The cold deepened. I went back into the bunker, the air inside marginally warmer than the damp night outside. I didn't turn on my phone's light, wanting to save the battery. I just sat on the floor in the pitch dark, the shoebox of letters in my lap, the silence of the concrete room, a strange comfort. I thought about the two versions of my grandfather, the one the world saw, the paranoid, broken man who abandoned his grandson, and the one who existed in this bunker, the meticulous, brave, and loving man who had orchestrated his own ruin to save me. The world had gotten it wrong, and I realized that's what systems do. They take complex, messy, human stories and flatten them into neat, simple files. They have to. It's the only way they can manage the sheer volume of human suffering they're designed to process. But in that flattening, the truth gets lost. Nuance dies. Sacrifice looks like abandonment. Protection looks like neglect. And a hero looks like a crazy old man. I was a product of that flattening. Leo Vance, case file number 734. But sitting there in the dark, I felt like I was finally becoming a person again. My story wasn't just a list of foster homes and behavioral reports. It had a beginning. It had a purpose. The sound of a car engine, faint at first, then growing closer, pulled me from my thoughts. I scrambled up the steps and peered out into the night. 2 headlights cut through the trees, bouncing and swaying as a vehicle navigated the rough track. It was a sturdy-looking SUV, and it pulled to a stop a few yards from the bunker. The engine cut out, and the forest was plunged back into silence and darkness. A car door opened and closed. A powerful flashlight beam sliced through the night, scanning the clearing before landing on me, a deer caught in its glare. "Leo Vance?" a voice called out. It was the same tired, gravelly voice from the phone. "It's me, Arthur Davies." "I'm here," I called back, my own voice tight. The beam lowered, and a figure emerged from behind it. He was an older man, tall and stooped, wearing a rumpled raincoat over a suit that had seen better days. He had a shock of white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the rain. His eyes, even in the dim light, were sharp and intelligent. He walked toward me, his gaze sweeping over the bunker, the open steel door, and then me. He looked me up and down, a long, appraising look. "You've got his eyes," he said, his voice softer now. I knew Sam for 30 years. He was the most stubborn, honorable man I ever met. and the biggest fool. He stuck out a hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "It's good to finally meet you, son. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." "Me too," I said. "He said you could help." "I can try," Davies said, his eyes scanning the tree line as if he expected to see someone watching us. "First things first, let's see what he left us. And we do it inside. I don't like being out in the open up here." We descended back into the bunker. Davies swept his powerful flashlight around the workshop, letting out a low whistle. He really did it. Built his own damn fortress. I told him he was crazy. Turns out he was the sanest one of us all. For the next hour, in the cold, dusty air of the bunker, I laid it all out for him. I gave him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression grim. I showed him the files in the cabinet, the soil reports, the photographs of the barrels. He examined each document under the beam of his flashlight, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't say much, just the occasional, "son of a bitch," under his breath. When he was done, he sat down heavily on the stool by the drafting table. He looked old and tired, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "It's all here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The whole damn thing. We had rumors, whispers. We never had proof. Not like this." He looked at me, his eyes full of a new, somber respect. "Your grandfather was a hero, Leo. He tried to do the right thing, and the world broke him for it. What they did to him, what they forced him to do to you, it's unforgivable." He stood up and began to pace the small space. "West Tech never went away. They just changed their name. They're called Horizon Holdings now. They're bigger, more powerful than ever. They've got lawyers on top of lawyers, and lobbyists in every pocket from here to the state capitol. The man who was CEO back then, a real piece of work named Marcus Thorne, is still on the board." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We've got the proof." Davies stopped pacing and looked at me. "It's not that simple, son. This evidence is more than a decade old. They'll argue it's inadmissible. They'll say your grandfather was a disgruntled employee with a grudge. They'll try to discredit him, and they'll try to discredit you. They'll bury us in legal motions until we run out of money and time." He ran a hand through his white hair. "And they'll do more than that. Sam was right to be scared. These people don't play fair. They won't hesitate to pressure you, to threaten you, to make your life a living hell." It was a sobering dose of reality. For a moment, in the flush of discovery, I had felt invincible. Now I just felt small. An 18-year-old kid against a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It was a joke. "But," Davies said, his voice hardening, "we have something they don't. We have the truth. And we have this land. As long as you own this property, they can't make this go away. It's a permanent thorn in their side." He pointed to the map on the drafting table. "This is the battlefield, Leo, and you're standing right in the middle of it." He laid out the strategy, his voice low and urgent. Our first move was to get the back taxes paid. If we let the county foreclose, the land would go to public auction, and Horizon would snap it up in a second. That was my $2,500. My entire bridge to the real world. Gone, just to hold the line. Next, we needed to file a preliminary injunction against Horizon, using the evidence to claim that any development on the surrounding properties posed an environmental risk. It was a long shot, but it would slow them down. It would force them to show their hand. "This is going to be a long, ugly fight," Davies warned me. "It could take years, It will consume your life. You'll be living on nothing, fighting an enemy with endless resources. You sure you're up for this? Your grandfather gave you an out. No one would blame you if you took it. I looked around the bunker, at the tools on the wall, the map on the table, the filing cabinet full of secrets. This place was more of a home than any of the houses or rooms I'd ever lived in. It was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to me. "I'm sure," I said. The words felt solid, real. "Good," Davies said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time. "Your grandfather would be proud." The next few weeks were a blur of motion and anxiety. Davies paid the back taxes first thing the next morning, draining my bank account down to almost nothing. I was officially the owner of a worthless, poisoned piece of land, and I had less than $100 to my name. I couldn't stay in a motel. I couldn't afford it. So I stayed in the bunker. It was my home now. Gus, from the general store, became my lifeline. When I walked in, thin and broke, and asked if he had any work, he just looked at me for a long moment and then nodded toward the back room. "Stocking shelves, sweeping up. Won't pay much, but I can give you credit for groceries." It was an act of quiet charity I knew I could never repay. He never asked about the bunker or why I was staying up on that hill. He just made sure I had food to eat. Sometimes other locals would come into the store while I was working. They'd look at me, and I'd see the recognition in their eyes. "Sam Vance's grandkid." They'd nod, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. They were watching, waiting, seeing what I was made of. I spent my days working for Gus, and my nights in the bunker. I cleaned it out, sweeping away the dust of a decade. I found a small, portable generator in a storage locker and got it running, which gave me light and enough power to charge my phone. I explored the 1.3 acres, walking the boundaries of my small kingdom. I found the creek my grandfather had marked, its water running clear and cold. I found the area he'd labeled Ground Zero. There was nothing to see, just a patch of woods that looked like any other. But knowing what was buried just a few feet beneath the soil made the air feel heavy, toxic. A few weeks after Davies filed the injunction, the first letter arrived. It was delivered to Gus's store, addressed to me. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, representing Horizon Holdings. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly chilling. It was a purchase offer. They offered me $50,000 for the 1.3 acres. $50,000. To me, it was an astronomical sum. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of seeing. It was a ticket out, a new life, handed to me on a silver platter. I could buy a car, rent an apartment in a city where no one knew my name. I could be normal. The offer sat on the table in the bunker for a day, a quiet, seductive poison. I called Davies. "It's their first move," he said, his voice calm. "It's a test. They're trying to see if you can be bought. What do you want to do?" I thought about the bus to Portland. I thought about the shelter, the life of quiet desperation they had planned for me. And I thought about my grandfather, humming in his workshop, choosing to disappear so I could live. "Tell them no," I said. The next offer came a week later, $100,000. I didn't even have to think about it. "No," I told Davies. The third offer was delivered by a man in a sharp suit who drove a sleek black car right up the washed-out track to my bunker. He was young, with a confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't introduce himself. He just handed me a briefcase. "Open it," he said. I did. It was full of cash, neat stacks of $100 bills. "That's $250,000, Mr. Vance," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Tax-free. It's a gift. All you have to do is sign the land over. No one needs to know. You can be on a beach in Mexico by morning." I stared at the money. It was an obscene amount. It was freedom. It was everything I never had. And it felt like the dirtiest thing I had ever touched. I looked up from the briefcase into the man's empty eyes. "My grandfather wasn't a crazy old man," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "He was a hero. And this land is not for sale." The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The mask slipped. I saw a flicker of cold, hard anger. Then the smile was back in place. "That's a shame," he said. He closed the briefcase. "I think you'll regret that decision. Mr. Thorne doesn't like loose ends." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving me standing in the silence, my heart hammering against my ribs. The threats weren't just words in a letter anymore. They were standing in my front yard. The fight was no longer just on paper. It was real, and it was here. That night I didn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. I sat with my back against the cold concrete wall, the crowbar resting by my side. I was alone, outgunned, and terrified. But I was not broken. The next morning, I walked out of the bunker and looked at my small patch of the world. The trees, the moss, the cold, clean air. It wasn't just land. It was a legacy. It was a headstone for a man who had no grave. It was a promise. I had no money. I had no power. All I had was a story, a rusty key, and a choice I had already made. I bent down and picked up a handful of dark, rich earth. It was mine. And I wasn't going anywhere. I had finally found my home. It was a strange and profound realization, standing there in the morning light. Home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you choose to defend. It's not about four walls and a roof. It's about the ground beneath your feet that you refuse to surrender. For 12 years, I had been adrift, a boat without an anchor, passed from one temporary harbor to another. I'd learned not to put down roots because I knew they'd just be torn up again. But here, on this forgotten hillside, surrounded by trees and ghosts, I felt rooted for the first time in my life. The bunker wasn't a prison. It was my castle. The woods weren't empty. They were my allies. The fight ahead wasn't a burden. It was my purpose. This inheritance, which had seemed like a curse, a final joke from a madman, was actually the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. It was the gift of identity. I was no longer just Leo, the orphan. I was Leo Vance, the guardian of my grandfather's truth. The legal battle dragged on, just as Davies had predicted. Horizon Holdings filed motion after motion, trying to get our injunction thrown out. Their lawyers were slick and ruthless. They painted my grandfather as a delusional fanatic. They painted me as an opportunistic kid trying to extort money from a respectable company. But Davies was a bulldog. He was old and slow, but he was relentless. He countered every motion. He used the documents from the bunker to sow just enough doubt, to raise just enough questions, that the judge couldn't simply dismiss the case. It became a war of attrition. They had the money, but we had the ground. They couldn't start their new development project with my property sitting like a poison pill in the middle of it, a constant, public reminder of their past sins. The community in North Fork, which had been watching from a distance, started to close ranks around me. It was never spoken. It was just in small actions. Gus started leaving a hot thermos of coffee for me on the counter every morning. Another old-timer, a retired mechanic, came up to the bunker one day and helped me build a proper wood-burning stove to fight off the damp winter cold. He said he'd known Sam, said he was glad to see Vance was back on the hill. The threats from Horizon became more subtle. Surveyors would show up at the edge of my property, planting stakes just over my property line. Low-flying helicopters would pass over the bunker late at night, their searchlights scanning the trees. It was psychological warfare. They wanted me to feel watched, isolated, and overwhelmed. They wanted me to break. But they didn't understand. I had been raised in isolation. I had been watched by caseworkers and therapists my entire life. I had been overwhelmed since I was 6 years old. This was a language I understood. And every act of intimidation just hardened my resolve. It proved that I was right. It proved that they were scared. One evening, a few months into the fight, I was in the bunker, going over the old files again, when I found something I'd missed. Tucked into the back of a folder labeled MISC was a small, sealed envelope. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Marcus Thorne, the CEO. Inside was a letter, also in my grandfather's hand. It wasn't angry or threatening. It was quiet and sad. "I know what you are," it said. "You're a man who believes the world is made of things that can be bought and sold. Land, people, truth. You are mistaken. There are things that have no price. A promise to a child, the clean water in a creek, a man's good name. I am sealing this land, Mr. Thorne, not to hide from you, but to wait for you. One day, someone will come who understands what this place means, and they will be the bill that finally comes due." He had written it knowing he would be gone. He had written it for his successor. For me. He wasn't just leaving me evidence. He was leaving me a mission statement. And he was speaking directly to his enemy across the gulf of time, telling him that the fight wasn't over, that a reckoning was coming. I photocopied the letter at the store the next day and mailed it to Arthur Davies. He read it over the phone to Horizon's lawyers during their next settlement conference. There was a long silence, Davies told me, and the offers stopped. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The legal battle would likely take years, maybe even the rest of my life. But something had shifted. It was no longer about winning or losing. It was about standing my ground. It was about honoring the sacrifice of the man who had given up everything for me. My life was not the one I would have chosen. It was cold and hard and lonely. But it was mine. I had chosen it. Standing at the entrance to the bunker, looking out at the morning mist rising from the forest floor, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I was home. The story isn't finished. The legal case against Horizon is ongoing, and the fight to get the land properly cleaned up and recognized as a contaminated site is a mountain we are still climbing. But we are climbing it. What I want you to take away from this, the reason I'm telling you all this, is to remind you of the power of a single choice. My grandfather made a choice to protect me. I made a choice to honor him. These decisions, the ones that feel impossible, the ones that ask you to choose between the easy road and the right one, they are the choices that define us. They are what turn a case file into a person. They are what turn a piece of land into a home. Your inheritance might not be a key to a bunker. It might be a story you were told, a value you were taught, or a wrong you feel you need to make right. Don't dismiss it. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless or sentimental. Sometimes, the most valuable things we are ever given are the burdens we choose to carry. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe and become part of this community. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell us about the inheritance you received that had nothing to do with money. I read every one, and I believe, just like my grandfather did, that the truth matters, and that none of us should have to fight for it alone.